She signed the divorce papers in the pouring rain, her hand unwavering, for she had long since run out of tears. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of control, isolation, and suffocation. And when it was all over, the man she once loved was certain she would disappear in silence. But weeks later, in the most luxurious ballroom in the city, before the entire upper class, he saw her. Not alone. And the man standing beside her made the entire room hold its breath. If you're reading this story, please like and comment the city you're viewing in, so I know how far my story has come. Don't leave, because the best part is yet to begin. The rain had been falling since noon, and by 9 in the evening it had turned the streets of Blackthorn City into something resembling the inside of a wound, dark, slick, and impossible to clean. Seraphina Vale sat in the back of a cab with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set in the particular way a person holds their face when they've decided to stop feeling things for a while. She was wearing a dress she'd bought herself 3 weeks ago, midnight blue. No one had told her it looked beautiful because she hadn't asked anyone. She'd stood in the dressing room alone, looked at her own reflection for a long time, and thought, good enough. That was the most generous thing she'd managed to say to herself in months. The divorce had been finalized 26 days ago. Everett Knox had made sure it happened quickly. His attorneys were the kind of men who wore watches that cost more than most people's cars, and they had filed and maneuvered and argued with the calm efficiency of surgeons removing something inconvenient. What Seraphina walked away with after 3 years of marriage could fit inside a single suitcase. The penthouse? His. The investment portfolio? His. The company's shares she'd never technically owned but had helped build through 7-day work weeks and silent sacrifices. His. Even the dog, a copper-haired retriever named Mira that Seraphina had raised from 8 weeks old, had somehow ended up in Everett's custody through a clause her own attorney had failed to catch. She hadn't fought for Mira. By the time the clause appeared in the paperwork, she'd been too tired to fight for anything. The cab rolled through a red light. The driver didn't say anything. Neither did Seraphina. The invitation had arrived 10 days ago. Cream cardstock, embossed lettering. The kind of thing designed to communicate that the person sending it considered themselves important enough that you should feel the weight of the paper. It was for the Ashford Foundation Masquerade Gala, an annual event hosted by Blackthorn City's oldest wealthy families, attended by the kind of people who donated to charities mainly so they could have their photographs taken doing it. Seraphina had attended twice during her marriage to Everett. She had stood at his side and smiled and said the correct things to the correct people and eaten food she didn't taste. She had no rational reason to go back. Her friend Margot had called her 3 times after the invitation arrived, each time with increasing urgency, and finally, on the 3rd call, she had said the thing she'd been building toward. Seraphina, he's going to announce his engagement tonight to Brianna Selsworth at the gala. He's doing it publicly, on purpose, because he wants you to hear about it secondhand and he wants it to hurt. Margot had paused then, waiting. I know, Seraphina said. So you're not going? I didn't say that. Another pause. Longer this time. Sarah, I'll be fine. She hadn't been fine for most of the last year, but that was beside the point. There were things a person did not do in front of Everett Knox, and falling apart was one of them. She had learned that the slow, grinding way, through small humiliations accumulated over months, until they became a permanent ache she couldn't locate precisely, only feel everywhere. The cab stopped in front of the Dorian Grand Hotel. Through the rain-streaked glass, Seraphina could see the red carpet, the valets in their white gloves, the clusters of photographers stationed like sentries behind velvet rope, women in gowns that cost as much as semester tuitions, men in tuxedos conducting small, serious negotiations while pretending to make small talk. She got out of the cab before she could change her mind. The rain hit her immediately. She'd refused the umbrella the doorman offered because accepting it felt like admitting she needed help. And she walked the carpet with water beating on her shoulders and her spine straight and her face arranged into an expression she had practiced in the mirror. Not a smile, not anger. Something in between, something that said, I am not interested in your opinion of me. Inside, the ballroom was everything she remembered. Chandeliers the size of carriages. Floral arrangements tall enough to block sightlines across tables. The low, constant murmur of a room full of people performing their own importance. A string quartet in the corner playing something vaguely classical that nobody was actually listening to. Seraphina took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and did not drink it. She moved through the room and felt the looks before she saw them. She had always been good at feeling eyes. During her marriage, she'd had a lot of practice. She spotted Everett 40 minutes after arriving. He was across the room near the central bar wearing a charcoal tuxedo and laughing at something the man beside him had said. The laugh was the one she knew from 3 years of proximity, slightly too loud, calibrated for an audience, designed to make everyone within earshot feel that they were witnessing charisma rather than performance. He had one hand resting on the lower back of a woman Seraphina recognized from tabloid photographs. Brianna Sellsworth, 24 years old, daughter of a pharmaceutical CEO. She was beautiful in the way that certain women are when they have never been told their value and so have never had the chance to doubt it. Seraphina felt nothing looking at her. She'd been afraid she would. She didn't. What she felt looking at Everett was something harder and quieter. Not hate. Hate required energy she didn't have. More like recognition, the specific exhaustion of finally seeing clearly a thing you had once spent enormous effort trying not to see. She turned away and walked toward the terrace doors. The terrace was empty. Of course it was. It was raining. But there was an overhang that kept one section dry, and Seraphina stood beneath it and breathed the cold, wet air and let the noise of the ballroom become something distant and manageable. Below, the city spread out in its wet, illuminated sprawl. Blackthorn at night, from this height, had a certain deceptive beauty. All those lights suggesting warmth and life when anyone who lived in it long enough knew the lights mostly meant commerce. She had been standing there perhaps 8 minutes when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting a waiter or another guest seeking solitude. Instead, she found a man she had never met, standing near the terrace door with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching her with the kind of stillness that most people were incapable of, the kind that suggested he had learned stillness the way you learned a language, through long, uncomfortable immersion. He was tall, dark suit, no tie, collar open one button in a way that on anyone else might have looked careless, but on him seemed like a deliberate choice. His face was not handsome in any obvious, symmetrical way. There was a scar along his left jaw, fine and old, and his features had the hard-edged quality of something that had been tested repeatedly and not broken. Dark hair, dark eyes that caught the light from the ballroom windows and did something complicated with it. He didn't introduce himself. "You've been standing out here for 9 minutes," he said. His voice was low. Not quiet. There was a difference, but pitched with the particular ease of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "I wasn't counting," Seraphina said. "I was." She studied him. He let her, which was itself unusual. Most men watched to be watched back. This one watched like he was cataloging information. "Should I know you?" she asked. Probably not from anything good. She almost laughed. She hadn't been expecting that. That's an honest answer. "I'm not known for dishonesty." He paused. "I'm known for other things." She turned back toward the city lights. "I'm not in the mood for cryptic, whoever you are." Kyle Draven. The name landed in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She felt the ripple before she consciously processed the source. Kyle Draven. She'd heard the name in the way everyone in Blackthorn City eventually heard it, sideways, in fragments, in sentences that trailed off. A man who owned things that didn't appear in any public registry. A man whose name appeared in the backgrounds of investigations without ever appearing in the conclusions. A man who, according to the kind of rumors that circulated in rooms like the one behind them, had built an empire in the city's underworld so thoroughly that dismantling him would require dismantling half of everything else first. She did not let the recognition show on her face, or tried not to. "And why have you been counting the minutes I stand on terraces?" she asked. "Because you're Seraphina Vale," he said, "and I've been looking for you for 2 weeks." That did land differently. She turned back to face him. "That's alarming." "It should be." He studied her with the same unreadable quality. "You were married to Everett Knox." "I was." "And before the divorce, you witnessed something you shouldn't have." The champagne glass she was still holding felt suddenly heavy. She set it carefully on the terrace railing. "I don't know what you're referring to." "You're a bad liar," he said, without malice, just observation. And you're remarkably direct for someone who just introduced himself as a name people only say in whispers. Something shifted in his expression then. Not much, just a degree or two of something that might have been acknowledgement. The evidence you gathered, he said, the files, the photographs, the account transfers you tracked across 6 shell companies. He paused. You have them. Her heartbeat had changed rhythm. She was aware of it. She kept her breathing steady through effort. You've done considerable research into my personal history. I've done considerable research into Everett Knox's financial operations, Kyle said. You're adjacent to that research. A beat. The evidence you have connects Knox's money laundering network to a trafficking operation that has been running through this city for 4 years. I've been dismantling that operation piece by piece. You have the piece I've been missing. The rain fell off the overhang edge in a continuous curtain. Somewhere below, a car horn sounded and went quiet. Why would I give you anything? Seraphina said. I don't know you. You know what I am. I know what people say you are. That's different. It's not, in this case. He took one step toward her, not threatening, but definite. Knox has people watching you, has since the divorce. He knows you have something on him. He's been deciding what to do about it. Another pause, and this one had weight in it. He's almost finished deciding. She held the man's gaze and felt the truth of what he was saying land against her chest like a second stone. She had known, in a low, quiet register she had been trying to ignore, that Everett wasn't finished with her. The divorce had been too clean, the settlement too straightforward for a man who litigated everything. He'd let her walk away with nothing because he was waiting, calculating, planning something that required her to feel safe first. What do you want from me? She asked. The evidence, Kyle said. In exchange, I will remove every threat against your life that Knox has set in motion. And if I don't? He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The answer was implicit in everything surrounding the conversation, in the name, the scar, the way he occupied space like he owned the rights to it. This is your version of a fair offer, she said. No, he said. This is the only offer there is. They stood looking at each other for a moment that lasted longer than its seconds. Seraphina had learned during her marriage to read the silences between what men said and what they meant. Everett's silences had always been manipulative, full of unspoken threats wrapped in plausible deniability. This man's silence was different. It was transactional, uncomfortable, but honest in the way that things without sentiment tend to be honest. I need time, she said. You have until tomorrow morning. That's not tomorrow morning. He took a card from his inside jacket pocket and placed it on the terrace railing beside her champagne glass. No name on it, just a number. After that, the timeline changes and my ability to manage Knox's plans changes with it. He turned toward the terrace door. Draven. He stopped. Seraphina picked up the card. The cardstock was plain, heavy. The trafficking operation. You said you've been dismantling it for 4 years. She looked at him. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I have personal reasons. She expected him to leave. Instead, he said, without turning fully back, Knox is going to humiliate you tonight. He's planned it. Announcement, then remarks about you specifically. Designed to make sure everyone in that room leaves with a particular image of you. A pause. You should decide before you go back in there whether you want to give him that. Then he went inside. Seraphina stood on the terrace with the card in her hand and rain drumming its steady percussion against the overhang above her. The city below hummed and flickered. She thought about leaving. She thought about the 3 boxes of documents hidden in the back of her sublet apartment's coat closet. Photographs, account statements, encrypted files she had spent 6 months carefully accumulating before she found the courage to file for divorce. She thought about the dog Everett had taken. She picked up the champagne glass and went inside. The ballroom was fuller now, denser with bodies and conversation, and the low electric anticipation that preceded formal announcements at events like this. Seraphina moved through it with the particular navigation of someone who had spent years learning how to take up exactly as little space as necessary. She was near the back of the room when Everett's voice cut through the ambient noise via the microphone at the front. He'd always been good at commanding a room. She'd admired it once when she was young enough and knew enough to confuse command for strength. He stood at the podium in his charcoal tuxedo with Brianna Sellsworth at his side, and he smiled the broad, warm smile that she knew from the inside was as structural as a load-bearing wall, ornamental and functional, and concealing everything behind it. He spoke about the Ashford Foundation. He spoke about philanthropy and community investment and the future of Blackthorn City. People applauded at the right intervals. Then he turned to Brianna and said what he had clearly come to say, that he was the luckiest man in this room, that life had a way of offering you what you truly deserved if you were patient enough to wait for it, and that some chapters needed to close before the right ones could open. Subtle enough to deny. Pointed enough that everyone understood. Seraphina heard the reference land in the room and felt the eyes turn toward her before she saw them. The particular quality of a crowd that has been given something to look at. She felt it like physical pressure, the weight of other people's interest on her skin. She started moving toward the exit. She didn't make it. Everett's voice changed as he stepped away from the podium, lighter, more casual, performing ease. He said her name across the room, the way men who have calculated the maximum damage say things casually, loud enough to carry but shaped to sound spontaneous. Seraphina, I didn't know you were here. You look... A pause that did more work than any adjective, tired. The laughter that followed was not universal, but it was enough. Seraphina stopped walking. She was aware of her own heartbeat, aware of the dress, the rain that had dried in the fabric, the one strand of hair that had come loose somewhere between the terrace and here. Aware of 200 people waiting to see what she would do with the small, precise wound that had just been publicly cut into her. She turned, and Cale Draven was standing 10 feet away, watching her, and in the fraction of a second before anything happened, he moved, cut through the crowd with the efficient grace of someone who had never once in their life asked a room to make space for them because rooms simply did, and was beside her before she had processed his approach. He put one hand on the small of her back. Light, deliberate. Knox, he said, addressing Everett across the room in a tone that had no color in it at all. Then, you should speak carefully to my wife. The room did not simply go quiet. It went the specific quiet of a space in which every person has simultaneously understood that the situation they are in is several orders of magnitude more serious than they realized. Brianna Sellsworth's smile dropped in pieces. Everett Knox stared at Kyle Draven with the expression of a man who has just pulled a thread and watched an entire wall come loose. Seraphina stood very still with Kyle's hand at her back and felt the absurdity and the danger and the strange, vertiginous sensation of something irrevocable occurring. She had not agreed to this. She had not had time to agree to anything. But she did not step away from him. She held Everett's gaze across the ballroom. All that distance, all those people, all those years of accumulated small destructions. And she held it without looking away, and without her hands shaking, and without asking anyone's permission for what she felt. The string quartet had stopped playing. No one had told them to. They simply had. Everett opened his mouth, closed it. A thing Seraphina had never once seen him do in 3 years of marriage. The man who always had words, controlled them, weaponized them, deployed them with surgical precision, standing in front of 200 people with his mouth opening and closing like something that had just been removed from its element. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Everett Knox smiled the way men smile when they are already planning something that will not happen in a ballroom, and said, pleasantly, "I wasn't aware. Congratulations." He turned back to the room. The conversation resumed jagged and awkward, and the quartet found their place again. Kyle's hand dropped from her back. "Come," he said, at a volume only she could hear. "I didn't agree to—" "I know." He was already moving toward a side exit. "Come anyway." She stood for one more second in the middle of the room with the noise closing back in around her, and Everett laughing somewhere behind her at something designed to look effortless. And then she followed Cale Draven through the side door and into the corridor beyond. Outside the ballroom, the sounds muffled immediately. The corridor was service-width, dim, utilitarian, the kind of space that exists in every grand hotel for the people who make them function without being seen. Cale walked at a pace she had to almost hurry to match, and didn't look back to see if she was keeping up. "That was not part of our conversation on the terrace," she said to his back. "No. You told me I had until tomorrow morning to decide." "You did. You just publicly claimed—" I changed the timeline. He stopped at a door and opened it without breaking stride, holding it for her. Knox was never going to wait until morning. He had men positioned at 3 exits when we were on the terrace. He was planning to follow you out. She walked through the door. They were in a service stairwell. How do you know that? Because I had men watching his men. He started down the stairs. This is what I do. Surveillance at a charity gala? Everywhere, he said simply. They descended 2 floors in silence, broken only by their footsteps and the building's ambient hum. At the bottom, another door opened into the hotel's underground parking structure. Concrete and cold fluorescence and the smell of exhaust and standing water. A car was waiting. Black, long, running. A man stood at the rear door and opened it as they approached without a word exchanged. Kyle stopped before she could get in. I need to know something. Seraphina looked at him. The parking structure's light was unforgiving, and she could see the scar on his jaw clearly, and the precise, careful way he held his face. The evidence, he said. Is it somewhere safe? Safe enough? That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It's not. She met his eyes. They were darker down here without the ballroom lights. You said you have personal reasons for going after this network. I did. What are they? He was quiet for 3 seconds exactly. She counted them in the silence. Then, my sister. She disappeared 4 years ago. 16 years old, they found a record of her in the network 6 months after she vanished. He said it in the flat, factual tone of someone who has compressed an enormous amount of pain into a format they can carry without showing. I've been looking for her since. Seraphina held that information and felt the specific weight of it. Is she still alive? She asked. Something moved through his expression. Fast. Gone. I don't know, he said. That's why I need the network dismantled. All of it, not parts. She stood in the fluorescent cold of the parking structure and thought about 3 boxes in the back of a closet in a sublet apartment. She thought about 6 months of careful, terrified documentation. Photographing documents through car windows, transferring files from Everett's home office at 3 a.m, building a case she had no idea how to use. She thought about a 16-year-old girl. If I give you the evidence, she said, what happens to Everett? He goes to prison, Kyle said. Or he doesn't live long enough to. I want him in prison, she said. I want him to stand in a courtroom and have it read back to him. I want him to understand that the law he bought doesn't protect him. Kale studied her for a moment. That's a specific kind of revenge. It's not revenge, she said. It's accountability. She paused. There's a difference. He held her gaze. The evidence first. The rest follows. She got into the car. The door closed. The car moved. Through the tinted windows, Blackthorn City slid past in wet, amber-lit fragments, storefronts and traffic signals, and anonymous faces in rain-dark coats, all of it humming with the ordinary, unaware energy of a city that didn't know yet that something underneath it was about to crack open. Seraphina kept her hands in her lap and her breathing even and thought about the man sitting across from her. This controlled, scarred, terrifyingly still man who had just told a roomful of Blackthorn's elite that she was his wife. She had no idea what she had just walked into. She was almost certain that by morning she would not be able to walk back out. Outside, the rain kept falling, and the city kept turning, and somewhere across town in a penthouse above the harbor, Everett Knox was already on the phone. The car moved through Blackthorn's wet streets without urgency, which was its own kind of statement. Men who were afraid moved fast. Men who owned the road moved like they had nowhere to be because everywhere was already theirs. Seraphina sat with 3 inches of leather seat between herself and K.L. Draven and watched the city slide past the tinted window and tried to organize her thoughts into something useful. It wasn't working. The thoughts kept interrupting each other. The ballroom, his hand at her back, Everett's face doing that thing it had done. The parking structure, my sister, the car. Now, here, this. She had spent 3 years learning to be quiet in the presence of powerful men. The skill came back automatically, like muscle memory from an injury. She hated that it did. Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere Knox's people can't follow. Cale was looking at his phone, not at her. We have approximately 40 minutes before he finishes his calls and starts making decisions. You're very confident about his timeline. I've been studying him for 11 months. He put the phone away. I know how he thinks. And how does he think? Kyle looked at her for the first time since the car had started moving, like a man who has never once faced a consequence he didn't buy his way out of. A pause. Which makes him predictable. And predictable men are manageable. Until they're not, Seraphina said. Something in his expression acknowledged that. Until they're not, he agreed. The car turned north, away from the hotel district, away from the glittering commercial center of the city, into neighborhoods that were older and quieter and carried their age with a kind of dignified decay. Brownstones with iron railings, corner stores with hand-lettered signs, streets where the lights were spaced wider and the shadows between them were deep. Seraphina didn't know this part of Blackthorn well. During her marriage, her geography had been determined by Everett, his offices, his restaurants, his events, his world mapped onto the city like a template over the real thing. The car stopped in front of a building that announced nothing about itself. 4 stories. Stone facade. No signage. The windows on the upper floors were lit, but their glass was treated to opacity from the outside. Cale was out of the car before the driver had fully stopped. He didn't wait to see if she followed. He walked to the building's front entrance, a heavy door, unmarked, and it opened before he reached it, from the inside, by a man whose size suggested he had been built for a specific purpose, and that purpose was not hospitality. Seraphina got out of the car. The rain had thinned to a mist that settled on her skin like cold breath. She walked to the door, and the large man held it without comment, and she went inside. The interior was not what she expected, though she couldn't have articulated precisely what she had expected. Not warmth, exactly, but not the bare utilitarian architecture of a place designed purely for function, either. The entry hall was low-lit and spare. Good furniture. Nothing decorative. The kind of space arranged by someone who understood the difference between comfort and indulgence and had chosen one deliberately. Kyle was already moving down a hallway to the left. 2 other men had appeared. Younger, watchful, with the particular quality of attention that suggested they were always listening to things happening in adjacent rooms. "Bring her to the study," Kyle said, to no one specifically, and disappeared around a corner. One of the younger men gestured for Seraphina to follow. She did, and noted that he walked slightly behind her rather than ahead, which meant she was being guided but not entirely trusted. She noted things like that now. She had learned to. The study was at the end of the hall. Kyle was already behind a large desk made of something dark and old, jacket off, rolled to his forearms, looking at a laptop screen with the focused compression of someone reading bad news and processing it faster than the news was arriving. There were 2 other people in the room. The first was a woman approximately Seraphina's age, maybe slightly younger, with close-cropped hair and the kind of angular face that looked permanently skeptical. She was leaning against the bookshelf with her arms crossed and a tablet in one hand, and she was looking at Seraphina with an expression that was specifically unfriendly. The second was a man in his 50s, compact and gray-haired, wearing the kind of suit that suggested he had come from somewhere formal and hadn't had time to change. He had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the eyes beneath them were sharp and tired in equal measure. "This is her," the woman said. Not a question. "Nora," Kyle said without looking up. It was one word and it contained a complete instruction. The woman, Nora, pressed her lips together and said nothing else. The older man extended his hand to Seraphina. "Marcus Fenn. I handle operations." His handshake was firm and brief. "You've caused considerable disruption to our evening." "I wasn't aware I was on your schedule," Seraphina said. Something in Fenn's expression shifted towards something that might eventually become respect. "Sit down, Ms. Vale." "I'll stand." He nodded, as if this was the correct answer. Cale looked up from the laptop. "Knox is already moving. He pulled 3 of his personal security detail from the hotel within 12 minutes of us leaving. They went to your apartment." The sentence landed in Seraphina's chest like cold water. "My apartment. The sublet on Harker Street." He watched her absorb this. "The evidence. You said it was safe enough. Where is it?" She looked at him, then at Fenn, then at Nora, who was still leaning against the bookshelf with her arms crossed, and her eyes on Seraphina with the particular intensity of someone who has already made a judgment and is collecting evidence for it. "If they're at my apartment," Seraphina said carefully, And the evidence is at my apartment. Is it at your apartment? She didn't answer immediately. Ms. Vale. Cale's voice didn't rise, but it changed in some way that suggested he had very little patience for delays he hadn't budgeted. I need to know right now whether we have a problem. The documents are in a storage unit, she said. Not at the apartment. She paused. The apartment has a decoy, a box with falsified versions, account numbers that look right but are off by 2 digits, file dates that don't match. Plausible enough to fool someone working quickly in the dark. Silence in the room. Then Fen said quietly, "She built a decoy." "I had 6 months to think about what he might do," Seraphina said. "I had time." Nora uncrossed her arms. She was looking at Seraphina differently now. Not warmly, but with an adjustment in the quality of her attention that acknowledged a variable had changed value. Cale leaned back in his chair. "Where's the storage unit?" "I'm not telling you that tonight." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees in the space of 1 second. "Ms. Vale, you introduced me to 200 people as your wife without my consent," Seraphina said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steady for years, and tonight she needed it. "You put me in a car and drove me to a location I don't know using men whose names I haven't been given. You told me I had until morning to decide, and then you decided for me." She looked at him directly. "The evidence is safe. You have my word. It exists, and that the copies at my apartment are designed to keep Knox's people occupied while we figure out the terms of whatever this is. There are no terms," Kyle said. "I told you. You told me the only offer was your offer. That's not a negotiation. That's a demand." She kept her eyes on his. "I'm not Everett Knox's wife anymore. I'm not anyone's anything until I decide to be. So we're going to sit down and talk through what you want, what I want, and what we can both agree to." The room held its breath. Fen was looking at Kyle with something careful in his expression. Nora had straightened away from the bookshelf. Cale looked at Seraphina for a long moment, the kind of look that took inventory. "Sit down," he said finally. "Ask me," she said. Another pause. "Please sit down." She sat. What followed was 3 hours of the most uncomfortable conversation Seraphina had experienced since the final mediation meeting before her divorce. Kyle laid out what he knew about Everett's operations in the same flat, factual manner he seemed to use for everything. A money laundering network built through 7 shell corporations across 3 countries, moving funds generated by a trafficking operation that used legitimate shipping infrastructure along the eastern seaboard. The trafficking network was not Knox's original creation. He had bought into it 3 years ago, the timing corresponding almost precisely with the first year of their marriage. While Seraphina had been standing at his side at galas and learning to make herself smaller, Everett had been laundering human suffering through the same financial systems she'd been kept deliberately ignorant of. She didn't let any of what she felt show while Kyle talked. She kept her breathing even, and her face composed and her hands still in her lap. And only later, much later, in the small hours of the night, would she allow herself to feel the full, nauseating weight of what it meant to have shared a bed with someone whose hands were built on that. "The man running the trafficking end," Kyle said. "Lucien Voss." Fen pulled up a photograph on the tablet and showed it to her. A man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that was handsome from a distance and wrong up close in ways you couldn't immediately quantify. "I don't recognize him," Seraphina said. "You wouldn't. Knox kept the 2 operations structurally separate." Cale folded his hands on the desk. "Voss runs 4 separate distribution routes. He's been trying to consolidate control of Blackthorn's entire underworld for 18 months. Knox gives him financial legitimacy. Voss gives Knox protection and leverage." He paused. "My sister's last known location was in transit on one of Voss's routes." Seraphina looked at the photograph again. "How long ago?" 4 years. She set the tablet down on the desk. "What do you need from my evidence specifically?" "The account transfers. Specifically the ones from 18 months ago that connect Knox's shell companies to Voss's logistics network. I have everything on Voss's end. I'm missing the Knox side of the transaction." He looked at her. "Without it, I can build a case against Voss, but it will take another 8 to 12 months working from what I have. With your documentation, we have enough to move in weeks." "Weeks," she said. "My sister has been missing for 4 years," he said. The flat tone didn't change, but something behind it did, barely perceptibly, like pressure building behind glass. I am not waiting another 8 months. Seraphina looked at him and saw it. Not vulnerability, which felt like the wrong word for what was visible in his face at that particular moment, but something more human than she'd been prepared for from a man whose name made rooms go quiet. A wound that had calcified rather than healed. The kind you carried because you had no choice. I'll give you the documents, she said. I want 2 things. You're not? 2 things, she said again. First, Knox goes to trial. You have connections I can only imagine. I want him in a courtroom, on record, with everything read back to him publicly. I don't want him to just disappear. I want his name destroyed by the law he spent 20 years buying. Cale looked at her for a moment. And the second, when this is over, I want help building the foundation. A legal organization for survivors, of trafficking, of abuse, of the network, with legitimacy, funding, real infrastructure. She paused. You said you protect people in your territory. I'm asking you to make that protection institutional. The room was quiet again. Fen was looking at his hands. Nora was looking at the ceiling. Kyle said, You're asking me to build you a charity. I'm asking you to help me build something that outlasts this, Seraphina said. Because dismantling a network isn't enough. Someone has to be there for what comes after. He studied her the way he had on the terrace, inventorying. You've been planning this. I've been surviving, she said. Planning and surviving look similar from the outside. The silence stretched. Then Kyle said, Agreed. Fen exhaled. Nora made a short sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. They worked through the night. Fen coordinated with people Seraphina wasn't introduced to through a communication system she wasn't explained. Nora, whose last name turned out to be Sark, and whose role turned out to be something between intelligence analyst and operational second, pulled up mapping systems and financial schematics and walked Seraphina through questions about the documents with the efficient precision of a machine that had briefly decided to be almost civil. By 3 a.m, Seraphina had told them everything she remembered about the documentation, approximate dates, account structures, the specific routing pattern she'd noticed between Knox's third shell company and an import logistics firm registered in a country she'd had to look up on a map. She had a good memory. She'd always had a good memory. Everett had used that against her too, in his way, reminding her of things she'd said in moments of vulnerability, replaying them back to her weeks later in contexts designed to make her feel foolish for having felt them. Memory could be a liability. She'd learned to make it an asset. Around 4, Nora left the room without explanation. Fen took a phone call and stepped out. Seraphina was alone with Kyle for the first time since the parking structure. She was sitting in the chair across from his desk, and he was looking at a series of financial diagrams on his laptop, and she was aware of her own exhaustion in a specific cellular way, the kind that settled into the bones and made everything feel slightly removed from its usual weight. You should sleep, he said, without looking up. I'm fine. You're not, but that's your choice. He looked up. There's a room on the 2nd floor. Clean. Locked from the inside if you want. Is that standard hospitality for people you've publicly claimed as your spouse? He looked at her steadily. I owe you an explanation for that. You do. Knox's men at the hotel were under instruction to follow you when you left. Alone, you would have been taken somewhere I couldn't get to you quickly. He paused. The announcement changed his calculus. Publicly associating you with me meant any move against you became a move against me. It bought time. It also made me a target, she said. Associated with you, I'm now on the radar of every faction that has a problem with K.L. Draven. Yes. So you traded one threat for several. I traded a certain immediate threat for uncertain future ones, he said. With certain threats, you die. With uncertain ones, you have options. She looked at him. You made that decision without asking me. I did. And if I'd wanted to make it myself? He held her gaze. Then you would have needed to be in a position to make it, and you weren't, because you were standing in that ballroom alone while Knox's man had a hand on his earpiece. Something in his voice didn't apologize but acknowledged. I'm not asking you to be grateful. I'm telling you what happened and why. Seraphina was quiet for a moment. The building was still around them, with the particular nighttime stillness of a place where the people inside were awake but quiet. Your sister, she said. What was her name? He looked at her. A fraction of a pause. Lena. How old would she be now? 20? A pause. She wanted to study architecture. Seraphina held that, the specific mundane detail of it, a 20-year-old who had wanted to study architecture, and what it meant that someone like Cale Draven was still carrying that particular fact 4 years after she'd vanished. I'm going to get the documents tomorrow, she said, and I'm going to help you finish this. He looked at her for a moment that had a different quality than the previous ones. Less inventory, more something she didn't have a word for yet. Get some sleep, he said. She went upstairs. The room was what he'd said. Clean, sparse, a lock on the door that worked. She didn't change out of the midnight blue dress because she had nothing to change into. She lay on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling and listened to the building's sounds and tried to make her body understand that it was allowed to rest. She was almost there when her phone buzzed. She'd forgotten she still had it. Nora hadn't taken it. A deliberate choice or an oversight, she wasn't sure. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. No greeting, just, we need to meet. Alone. I have information about Draven you need to hear. MF. She read it twice. Marcus Fenn. The man who handled operations, who had been in the room all night, who had looked at Kyle with that careful expression she hadn't been able to fully read. Seraphina sat up in bed with the phone in her hands, and the city's gray pre-dawn light beginning to thin the darkness at the window's edges, and thought about what it meant that the man running Kyle Draven's operations had waited until she was alone, and Kyle was 2 floors away to send her a message that began with the word alone. She thought about Everett, who had also always said the important things when no one else was listening. She thought about a storage unit across the city holding documents that could end 2 men and save an unknown number of others. She thought about a girl named Lena who had wanted to study architecture. Her thumb hovered over the screen for 4 seconds exactly, and then she typed, when and where. The response came in under a minute. Sunrise. The coffee stand on Mercer and 9th. Come without telling him. Seraphina set the phone face down on the covers and lay back and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep at all. At 5:45, she got up, ran water over her face in the attached bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Dress from the night before, mascara that had migrated, hair that had long abandoned whatever shape it had started the evening in, and made a decision about the kind of person she was going to be in the next hour. Not careful, not compliant, present, and watching, and ready to be wrong about everything she thought she knew. She unlocked the door and went downstairs. The building was quieter than it had been, but not empty. One of the younger men was in the entry hall, and he watched her come down the stairs with the alert stillness of someone who had not slept and had not been asked to. He didn't stop her when she moved toward the front door. Either he had instructions that allowed her to leave, or he had instructions that didn't account for her leaving this early, or Cale Draven had a different philosophy about confinement than Everett Knox had. She went outside before she could think about it further. The city at 5:50 in the morning had a particular quality she had forgotten during the years of her marriage. The years when her schedule had been determined by someone else's calendar, and she had not risen before 7 unless Everett required it. Blackthorn at this hour was honest in the way it wasn't at any other time. The rain had stopped. The streets were still wet, and the light coming in from the east was gray and specific, illuminating the ordinary machinery of a city before it put its performance face on. Delivery trucks. A man walking a dog in a coat that had seen too many winters. A woman in scrubs waiting for a bus with the 1,000-yard stare of someone coming off a night shift. Seraphina walked 8 blocks to Mercer and 9th and found the coffee stand. A converted window cut into the side of a brick building. 1 man inside. Industrial machine, no aesthetic pretension whatsoever. She ordered a coffee she paid for with cash she had in the dress's single small pocket, because she had learned during the documentation months to always have cash in whatever she was wearing, and stood with the cup in both hands and let the warmth come through the paper, and waited. Marcus Fenn arrived 4 minutes later. He looked worse than he had at 4 in the morning, which was considerable. The gray had deepened under his eyes, and the suit jacket was gone, and his reading glasses were down from his forehead and actually on his face now, which made him look older and more tired and somehow more trustworthy, which she noted and held with appropriate suspicion. He ordered nothing from the stand. He stood beside her and looked at the empty street for a moment, And then he said, without preamble, "How much do you actually know about why K.L. Draven wants your evidence?" "He told me," Seraphina said. "The trafficking network, his sister." "He told you about Lena?" "Yes." Ben was quiet. He took the reading glasses off and folded them and put them in his shirt pocket. "And you believed him?" "I found him credible." She looked at Fen. "Is he lying?" "No." Fen looked down the street. "Lena is real. She disappeared 4 years ago. He's been looking for her every day since." He paused. "That part is the truth." "Then what part isn't?" Fen turned to face her, and she could see that he had been carrying what he was about to say for a long time. Not just tonight, but long enough that it had settled into the lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth. "The trafficking network that took Lena. Kale has told you Knox and Voss built it." "Yes." "Knox bought in 18 months ago. Voss has been running the operation for 4 years. Fen paused. "What Kyle has not told you is that 4 years ago, before Voss was running it independently, the network was partially funded and operationally supported by a third party." He looked at her. "That third party provided seed capital, logistical infrastructure, and political cover during the network's first 18 months of operation." Seraphina felt the coffee cup in her hands, and the morning cold on her face, and the specific creeping sensation of a floor beginning to tilt beneath her. "Who?" Fen's jaw tightened. "A holding company called Ardent Meridian, registered in Cyprus. The beneficial owner, traced through 4 layers of corporate structure, is—" He stopped. "Tell me." "K.L. Draven." The street was very quiet. Somewhere a block away, a truck's brakes hissed. A bird made a sound in the eave above the coffee stand. Seraphina's hands tightened around the cup, and she felt the cardboard flex slightly, and she looked at Fen and did not speak for 10 seconds. "You're telling me," she said finally, and her voice came out lower than she intended, "that the man who has been hunting this trafficking network built the infrastructure that started it. He didn't know what it would become." Fen said this quickly, not defending Kyle exactly, but contextualizing. 4 years ago, Ardent Meridian was a logistics holding company, shell within shells. Kyle was using it to move money through the eastern seaboard's shipping infrastructure. Standard underworld financial engineering, clean enough at surface level. He sold his interest in it 22 months ago when he started cleaning up operations across the city. Fen paused. What he didn't know when he built Ardent Meridian, what he genuinely did not know, was that Voss had been using the logistics infrastructure as cover for trafficking routes for at least 14 months before Kale divested. "He didn't know," Seraphina said. "He found out 14 months later, when Lena disappeared." Ben's voice flattened. "When he traced her disappearance back through Voss's operation and found Ardent Meridian in the architecture." A pause that had mass in it. "He's been operating under the knowledge that he accidentally funded the network that took his sister for 3 years. He has told no one." Seraphina set the coffee cup down on the window ledge of the coffee stand because she didn't trust her grip on it anymore. She turned to face the street and put her hands in the pockets of the midnight blue dress that she had worn for 21 hours now, and breathed the cold morning air, and thought about what she'd said to Kyle in the study last night. "I want him in a courtroom. I want accountability." "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you're about to hand him documents that will be used in a legal proceeding," Fen said. "And because when those documents are submitted, Knox's defense attorneys will investigate every thread. They will find Ardent Meridian. They will trace it to Kyle. And when they do, the case against Knox and Voss doesn't collapse. The evidence is the evidence, but Kyle becomes part of the story." He paused. His name in that proceeding changes everything. The city's power structure, the factions that have been keeping a careful distance, everything destabilizes at once. "You're telling me to not give him the documents." "I'm telling you to understand what you're giving them to." Fen looked at her directly. "And I'm telling you that Kyle doesn't know I'm having this conversation with you. He would not be glad about it." "Then why are you risking it?" Ben was quiet for a long moment. A car passed. Its headlights swept the wet pavement. "Because I've worked for Kyle Draven for 11 years, and I believe he is trying to fix something he broke by accident, and that the trying is genuine." He paused. "And because you walked into that room last night with nothing except evidence and nerve, and you negotiated with him like someone who has a right to know everything that concerns them." He looked at her. "You have a right to know this." She stood in the early morning cold and let the information rearrange itself inside her. Kael's money in the infrastructure, Lena in the roots, 4 years of hunting a monster he'd accidentally helped feed, the specific terrible geometry of it. She thought about his face when he'd said her name, the flat tone that didn't change but the thing behind it that did. I don't know. Answering whether Lena was alive. That's why I need the network dismantled, all of it. Does he believe the documents will expose him? She asked. He believes his connection to Ardent Meridian is buried deep enough that Knox's attorneys won't find it in time. Ben's expression said what he thought of that belief. But you don't think so. I think Knox has been investigating Kael for 11 months. I think he has people who are very good at finding things, and I think if there is a thread connecting Kael to that network's origin, Knox will pull it the moment those documents are submitted. He paused. Which means the case against Knox might succeed and destroy Kael simultaneously. Seraphina looked at the street. Go back to the house, Fen said. Act normal. I need you to not tell him about this conversation. Why? Because I need to verify one more thing before this becomes a confrontation. He put the reading glasses back on. Habitual gesture, she realized, something he did when he was moving from conversation into work. Give me until tonight. She looked at him, measured the specific quality of his exhaustion against the alternative explanation, which was that this was a layer of something she couldn't see the bottom of. If you're managing me, she said, I need you to understand that I have spent 3 years being managed by a man who is very good at it, and I will know. Fen held her gaze. I'm not managing you. I'm trying to keep 3 separate catastrophes from happening simultaneously. She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. Tonight, she said, and then I decide what to do with what you've told me. She walked back to the building alone. The younger man was still in the entry hall. He nodded when she came in as if her return had resolved something he'd been waiting on. She went upstairs. She changed out of the dress. Nora had left a plain shirt and dark pants outside the room door at some point during the early morning, without note or explanation, which was its own kind of communication, and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. She was still sitting there when a knock came at the door 20 minutes later. We're moving in 2 hours, Kael's voice said through the door. The storage unit. I'll go with you. She looked at the door. I'll be ready. A pause. There's food downstairs. She waited until his footsteps moved away from the door, and then she got up and stood at the window and looked at the city below, and tried to hold everything she now knew about Kael Draven in the same space as everything she had seen in his face when he said Lena's name. She could not decide whether those two things were reconcilable, and she did not have time to figure it out before she had to go downstairs and look at him and behave normally, whatever that meant in this context. She went down. He was at the kitchen table with coffee and a map of the storage facility's district spread flat on the surface, marked in pencil in 3 places. He was wearing different clothes, dark shirt, dark jacket, and he had shaved, and the scar on his jaw was more visible without stubble softening it. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her for a moment in the way that she was beginning to recognize, the inventory look, and then looked back at the map. The unit is on Calloway, she said, sitting across from him. Under a name Everett doesn't know. I rented it 7 months before the divorce, paid 18 months in advance in cash. Thorough. Frightened, she said. Those look similar too. He glanced up at that. Something in his face registered the correction. Nora will run perimeter before we arrive. We go in, retrieve the documents, and return here for processing. He looked at the map. If Knox's people are already watching the district, we go to contingency. What's contingency? We take what we need, and we don't go back. She drank her coffee and looked at the map and said carefully, neutrally, when the documents are processed, when your people have what they need, what's the timeline for moving against Knox? 2 weeks, Kael said. Maybe less. And Voss? Simultaneously, he looked at her. They have to move at the same time. If either one gets advance warning, they rabbit. She nodded, looked at the map. The documents connect Knox's shell companies to Voss's logistics infrastructure. What they won't show directly is the origin of that infrastructure. She kept her voice even. For the legal case to be airtight, we'd need to trace the logistics network back to its founding. He was quiet for 1 beat. 2. The case against Knox doesn't require that. What you have is sufficient. I know. She looked at him. I'm thinking about defense strategies. Knox's attorneys will investigate everything. Something moved through Kyle's face, fast. She almost missed it. Let them. Even if they find things that complicate the case? His eyes held hers. There's nothing to find that changes what Knox did or what he's doing now. I didn't say it changed what he did, Seraphina said. I said it might complicate the case. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city was filling with morning traffic, the muffled sound of it constant and distant. What are you asking me? He said. I'm not asking you anything yet. She looked down at the map. I'm thinking out loud. He watched her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he folded the map along its creases and stood. We leave in 90 minutes. She nodded. He left the kitchen. She sat with her coffee and her cold knowledge and the sound of the city filling in outside, and thought about what Fenn had told her and what she was going to do with it, and found that she could not arrive at a clean answer. Only at a series of questions that each led to a different version of the same person standing in a storage facility on Calloway Street, documents in hand, deciding who she was going to trust. They drove to Calloway in 2 vehicles, Kyle in the first with her, Nora, and 2 others in the second. The storage facility was the kind of place designed for anonymity. Long rows of numbered units behind a security gate, operated by a code, no staff on site before 8 in the morning. Nora called clear on the perimeter when they arrived. No visible surveillance, no parked vehicles that didn't belong. Seraphina had the code. She entered it at the gate and walked the row to Unit 114 and used a key she kept on a chain inside her clothes to open the padlock and rolled up the door. The box was where she had left it. Plain cardboard, unremarkable. Inside it, 9 months of documentation compressed into organized files. Photographs, bank transfer records, account routing sheets, a portable drive containing encrypted copies of everything digital. The records of a man destroying people for money, accumulated by the woman who had slept beside him. She stood looking at it for a moment. Kyle stood behind her. She was aware of him, his stillness, the quality of his attention when he was holding himself back from moving. She picked up the box. She turned and held it out to him. He took it. Their hands were close together on the box's edges for 1 second. Her grip and his grip, and the weight of everything inside it between them. Then she let go, and he had it. He handed it to the man beside him without looking at it. Get it to Sark. Start with the account transfers 18 months ago. Cross-reference the routing codes I gave you this morning. The man took the box and walked back toward the vehicles. Kale looked at Seraphina. Thank you. She had not expected those words from him. The formality of them, the weight. She studied his face and saw the genuine quality of it. Not performance, not calculation. A man who had just received something he had been trying to reach for 4 years and understood what it cost the person who gave it. She was still deciding what to do with what Fenn had told her. She was still deciding when Nora's voice came over the radio clipped to Kyle's jacket. We have incoming. 4 vehicles, moving fast, Calloway from the north, not ours. Everything changed tempo. Kyle's hand was at her arm immediately, not rough but definite, moving her back toward the storage row away from the entrance. Go to the back gate, he said, low and fast. Nora has the code. The sound of tires on the facility's gravel entrance cut him off. 3 black SUVs came through the gate before it fully registered that they had breached the code, either by force or by having it. The 4th vehicle came in from the south entrance simultaneously, boxing the facility. Kale's men moved with the tight, immediate efficiency of people who had rehearsed for this possibility. 2 of them were already repositioning, using the storage unit doors as cover. Nora was on the radio with short, clipped communications that Seraphina couldn't fully hear. The documents, Seraphina said. The man who took the box. He's clear, Kyle said. He went out the pedestrian exit 2 minutes before. His hand was still at her arm. They're not here for the documents. She looked at him. Then what are they here for? He looked at her with a directness she hadn't yet seen from him. You. The SUV doors opened and men came out with the specific practiced movement of people who do this for a living and know that the first 30 seconds determine everything. Seraphina counted 8, 9, 10, all armed, moving in a spread pattern that closed off the facility's interior systematically. And then a figure got out of the lead SUV that she recognized. Not Knox. Worse. Lucien Voss was shorter than his photograph had suggested and moved with the rolling, unhurried physicality of a man who had never needed to hurry because he always arrived after the room had already been secured for him. He was wearing a pale gray suit in a storage facility at 7 in the morning, as if location had no meaning. His face up close was exactly what she'd thought when she'd first seen the photograph. Handsome in the wrong way. The kind of face that smiled with the muscles and not with anything behind them. He stopped 20 feet from where she and Kyle stood, and he looked at Kyle with the expression of a man concluding a long conversation. "Draven," he said. The voice was pleasant. Southern European accent, faint. "I've been trying to get your attention for 2 years. I appreciate you finally making it convenient." Kyle said nothing. Seraphina could feel the quality of his stillness change. The same stillness he always carried, but now with something beneath it that was different. Like the difference between still water and water that is still because it is very, very deep. Voss looked at Seraphina. His eyes moved over her with an assessment that had nothing personal in it, the assessment of someone pricing inventory. "Ms. Vale, the documents you had in that storage unit, we'll need those." "They're gone," Seraphina said. Voss smiled. It did exactly what she'd predicted. Muscles only. "They were 30 seconds ago, yes. My people are picking up your courier right now." He looked back at Kyle. "I'm not here about the documents, frankly. I'm here because Knox has become a liability, and I need to have a conversation with you about restructuring our city's arrangements." "Knox works for you," Kyle said. "Knox worked with me," Voss said. "Past tense is important. He's been making emotional decisions since the gala last night. Emotional men are expensive." He tilted his head slightly. "You've been dismantling my network piece by piece for 4 years. I've let you because you were useful. You cleaned up operators who were creating problems for me. But we've reached a point where your cleaning is cutting into operational capacity." He paused. "I want to talk about boundaries." Kale looked at him for a moment. "No." Voss's smile didn't move. "Kale, I know about Ardent Meridian." The words landed in the storage facility and bounced off the metal doors and didn't go away. Seraphina stopped breathing. She looked at Kyle. His face had done the thing she'd seen once before, the fast movement of something through a carefully held expression, gone before it fully arrived. Voss continued pleasantly, "I know you didn't understand what the logistics infrastructure was being used for when you built it. I want you to know that I know that." A pause. "I also want you to know that nobody else needs to know it. If you're willing to discuss a reasonable arrangement." "You're blackmailing him," Seraphina said. Voss looked at her with something approaching mild surprise. "I'm offering stability," he said. "Blackmail implies threat. I'm offering mutual benefit." He looked at Kyle. "Walk away from the Knox case. Let it go cold. Allow my operations to function without your interference for the next 18 months while I relocate the infrastructure to other cities." A pause. "In return, Ardent Meridian stays buried. Your name stays clean. And—" He reached into his suit jacket and produced a photograph, which he held at a distance she couldn't see clearly. "Lena comes home." The storage facility was absolutely silent. Kale stood very still. Seraphina looked at his face and saw, for the first and only time in the hours she had known him, something crack open that he had not intended to show. Not much. A millimeter. But visible, unmistakable. The specific undoing of a person confronted with the one thing they cannot hold against. "She's alive," Voss said simply. "Has been. She's—" A small pause, calibrated, comfortable under the circumstances. "She has been, for some time." Kale's jaw tightened. One motion, controlled. "Let me see the photograph." "When we have an agreement." The two men looked at each other across 20 feet of gravel and the accumulated wreckage of 4 years of the same war. Seraphina looked at Kyle and understood, in the fast cellular way that she had learned to understand things that were too dangerous to take slowly, that everything she'd thought she was navigating had just become something else entirely, that the man beside her was standing at the edge of the worst decision of his life, with his face doing that millimeter thing, and his hands at his sides, and his sister's name hanging in the cold morning air between him and the person who had been holding her for 4 years. She looked at Voss. She looked at the 9 armed men positioned across the facility. She looked at the box that was no longer in the facility because it had walked out with a courier who Voss's people were, right now, in the process of intercepting right now on a road Seraphina didn't know the name of, carrying evidence she had spent 9 months of her life building, and everything, every piece of the architecture she and Kael had assembled in the last 12 hours, was coming apart at its seams simultaneously. She did the only thing she could think of. "The courier doesn't have everything," she said. Voss looked at her. "What?" she. "The drive, she said. "The encrypted drive with the digital copies. It's not in the box." She held Voss's eyes and kept her voice at the specific register of someone telling the truth, which she had practiced against a man who was very good at detecting the difference. "I kept it separate. It's the most important piece. The account transfers, the routing codes, everything that connects your logistics infrastructure to Knox's shell companies at the transactional level." She paused. "Without it, the physical documents are incomplete, suggestive but not prosecutorial." Voss studied her for 3 seconds. "Where is it?" "With me," she said. "On me." She watched his eyes. "Which means your arrangement with Kael just got more complicated, because now you need 2 things instead of 1. And one of them is not something your men can take from me without making a decision about what I am to Kael that changes everything else you're trying to negotiate." The storage facility was very quiet. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Kael with something that might have been reassessment. "She's useful," he said in a tone that was almost admiring and was entirely predatory. "Don't," Kael said. One word, the flattest she'd heard from him. Voss turned back to Seraphina. "Show me the drive." "Show me the photograph," she said. A pause. Then Voss held the photograph out toward her. Not enough to take, but enough to see. She looked at it. A young woman, dark-haired, sitting at a table in a room that had no identifying features. She was thin in the way people get thin when food is a controlled variable rather than a constant. But she was upright, and her eyes were open, and she was looking at the camera with an expression that had not been completely extinguished. Alive. Seraphina had not been certain she would be. She looked at Kael. He had not looked at the photograph. He was looking at Voss with the particular quality of a man doing complex mathematics behind a still face. "The drive," Voss said. Seraphina reached into the neckline of the borrowed shirt. Because Nora had left her clothes, and Nora was standing 30 feet away behind a storage unit door with a weapon and the kind of patience that had clearly been built through long practice. And she produced a small black drive the size of her thumb and held it up. Voss's eyes tracked it. "Here's what happens now," Seraphina said. "You release Lena. Confirmation in this facility before I take one step toward you. Live communication, voice, video, something verifiable." She kept her voice level. "You get the drive. Kael gets his sister. Knox is a separate conversation." Voss tilted his head. "You're negotiating for him." "I'm negotiating for an outcome," she said. "There's a difference." Voss was quiet for a moment. Then something happened in his face. Not warmth, but the particular satisfaction of a predator who has decided to enjoy the approach rather than rushing the conclusion. "Get Reyes on the line," he said to the man nearest him. The man produced a phone. 30 seconds of waiting during which Seraphina counted the armed men, counted Kael's men visible in the facility, estimated the distance between herself and the south pedestrian exit, and concluded that the numbers were not workable. A voice came over the phone's speaker. Female. Young. Slightly roughened, the way voices get after a long time in dry, enclosed spaces. Yes, one word. But Kael's entire body registered it, not visibly, not in any way Voss could use, but she was standing close enough to him to feel the change in the quality of his stillness, like something that had been pulled taut for 4 years, releasing 1 degree. "Say your name," Seraphina said toward the phone. A pause. Then, "Lena Draven." Seraphina looked at Kael. He was looking at the phone. His jaw was working slightly, the scar on it moving with the microtension of his muscles. and his eyes had the specific quality of a man refusing to feel something in public that is trying very hard to be felt. Seraphina walked toward Voss and held out the drive. Everything happened at once. The drive left her fingers. Voss's hand closed around it, and Kale moved, not toward Voss, but to the left, fast, with the decisive geometry of someone who had been calculating an angle for the last 4 minutes and had just determined it was workable. He reached Nora's position in 3 strides and took the weapon from her hand without stopping moving. Voss's men reacted. Of course they did. But Kyle was already behind the storage unit door, and the first shot that came cracked against metal and went wide. And then Kyle's men, positioned since the moment the SUVs had come through the gate, opened up from 3 separate angles simultaneously. The facility erupted. Seraphina dropped flat against the gravel and rolled toward the nearest unit door and got her back against the cold metal and pulled her knees to her chest as the sound of gunfire compressed itself into the enclosed space and became something physical, something that hit the chest and the eardrums and the base of the skull all at once. She was not a person who had been in gunfire before. Her body registered this fact with complete animal clarity. The shaking that started in her hands and moved inward, the way her vision narrowed to a tunnel of immediate detail, the gravel pressing into her palms with extraordinary specificity, as if her nerves had decided that texture was the most important information available. She breathed again. The way he had told her, though he hadn't told her this exactly, hadn't given her instructions for this moment specifically, but she applied the principle. Stop asking permission to become dangerous. She applied it to her own nervous system. She told her hands to stop shaking, and they didn't stop, but they steadied, which was different. She looked around the edge of the unit door. Voss was not in the open. His men had taken cover positions around the SUVs, and a firefight was ongoing across the facility in short, controlled exchanges. Kyle's people moving and repositioning with the efficiency of a unit that had trained together. Voss's people outnumbered at their original positions because several of them had repositioned to pursue the courier. The courier. The box. The physical documents. She thought about it for 1 second and then stopped thinking about it because it was outside her control, and the thing inside her control was the distance between her back and the south pedestrian exit. She ran, not standing, bent, fast, using the storage unit row as cover, staying below the sightlines of both groups, the gravel under her feet loud in her own ears, and probably not loud at all over the noise of the firefight. She reached the end of the row, looked, clear, went around the corner into the next row. The pedestrian exit was 40 feet ahead. She was 20 feet from it when the man stepped out from between 2 units directly into her path. He was one of Voss's. She could tell from the way he was moving, the orientation of his attention, the fact that his weapon came up immediately when he saw her, rather than dropping, which was what Kyle's men would have done. He was young, dark jacket, and he had the look of someone who had just been in radio contact and been given a specific instruction about her. She stopped. He said, "The drive. It was empty." She breathed. "Wiped," he said. "Blank. Formatted." His weapon was level. "Where's the real one?" The drive she had given Voss had been the drive she used to store photographs during the documentation months, wiped clean 8 weeks ago when she transferred everything to the actual encrypted backup. She had been carrying it in the lining of various items of clothing since then because her hands needed something to hold in the worst moments. She looked at him and made the calculation about what she would need to do in the next 3 seconds and whether she was capable of it. She was still making the calculation when a hand came around the corner of the unit and hit the man at the base of the skull with the handle of a weapon, and he went down in a single, boneless drop. Nora looked at her over his unconscious body. "Move," she said. Seraphina moved. They went out the pedestrian exit at a run and into the street behind the facility, and there was a car. Not one of the vehicles from the convoy, a different one, dark blue, ordinary, parked 30 feet down with its engine running and a man Seraphina didn't recognize at the wheel. "Get in," Nora said. She got in. Nora got in beside her. The car moved. "Kyle, Seraphina started. "Is doing what he's doing," Nora said. She was checking something on her phone with one hand and her weapon with the other with the multitasking fluency of someone who had been doing both for a long time. "He knows where we're going." "Where are we going?" "To get the courier, before Voss's people do." Seraphina pressed her back into the seat and felt the shaking in her hands and let it happen now that no one was pointing anything at her. The drive I gave Voss was empty. I know. Does Kyle know? Nora looked at her sideways for a moment. He will. She paused. Where's the real one? Seraphina reached into the lining of the borrowed shirt, a different seam further back, and produced a second drive, identical in size and color to the first. She held it up. Nora looked at it, then at Seraphina. You had two. I had two. A pause. Since when? Since I started building the case, Seraphina said. I never kept anything in one place. Not documents, not copies, not backups. She looked at the drive. Everett taught me that, actually. He always had redundancies. He just never considered that I was paying attention. The car moved through Blackthorn's morning streets, which were filling now with commuters and delivery vans and the ordinary, oblivious traffic of a city that didn't know that in a storage facility on Callaway Street, something significant had just cracked open. Sirens in the distance. Someone had called in the gunfire, which meant a clock was running on everything. Nora was on the phone and clipped half sentences that Seraphina tracked for information. The courier was 2 miles away, moving on foot after abandoning his vehicle when he'd spotted the tail. Voss's people were 2 blocks behind him. Cale's remaining people were converging. ETA? Seraphina asked. 4 minutes. Nora looked at her. Maybe 3 if we run a light. They ran 2. The car stopped on a narrow street in the warehouse district, where the morning light came through at a low angle between the buildings and made everything look briefly like something it wasn't. Seraphina got out before Nora told her to because she'd seen the man. Young, slight, collar up against the cold, moving fast along the building wall with a cardboard box under his arm that was not subtle, and he clearly knew it. She moved toward him. Give it to me. He looked at her, looked at Nora behind her, made the calculation about authority, and landed in the right place. He handed her the box. The box was lighter than it had been in the storage unit. She opened it in 3 seconds, hands that had decided to work clearly, decisively, because the shaking had run through its cycle and come out the other side, files intact, all of them, the photographs, the account statements, the routing sheets, everything she had built. She closed the box, footsteps behind her. She turned. Kyle. He was on foot, which meant the facility was behind him, and what was happening there was either resolved or abandoned. There was a cut along his left forearm, jacket sleeve torn, blood darkened into the fabric, and he was breathing at a rate that suggested the last 10 minutes had required more than stillness. He looked at her, then at the box, then at her again. You're not hurt, he said. No. He looked at Nora. Something passed between them in the silence that had the shorthand quality of people who had worked together for years. Nora looked away. The drive you gave Voss, he said, was empty. She watched his face. The real one is here. She held it up. Both copies are accounted for. He looked at the drive for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then, you knew that might happen, the confrontation. I knew something might happen, she said. I didn't know what. I prepared for options. He was quiet. The warehouse district breathed its cold industrial morning around them. Diesel, river water, the distant sound of a freight operation somewhere nearby. Voss knows about the drive now, that it was empty. He'll escalate, Seraphina said. Yes, I know. This becomes a different situation. It already was a different situation. She looked at him directly. I know about Ardent Meridian. The words left her mouth before she'd finished deciding to say them. Kyle went very still, not the controlled stillness she'd observed in him since the terrace. A different kind. The kind that happens when a person's body receives information that their prepared responses don't have a category for. Ben, he said. Not a question. He thought I should know. A pause. A long one, measured in the ambient sounds of the district filling the space where his words would have been. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the distance between them on that narrow street was 5 feet and felt like considerably more. And, he said, and I gave you the documents anyway. She held his gaze. I need you to understand that I'm not saying this to make you feel something about it. I'm saying it because it changes the legal strategy and we need to talk about it. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face that was not the 1 millimeter thing from before. It was deeper, slower, the kind of movement that happens when a person lets something surface that they've been holding down through sustained effort. It was my money in the architecture, he said. I know what that means. It means your attorneys need to get ahead of it before Knox is due, she said. It means the timeline for moving against Knox just shortened because Voss is going to go to Knox with what happened at the facility, and Knox is going to pull every thread he has to find leverage. An ardent meridian is a thread. She paused. And it means you should have told me. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. I should have. The honesty of it landed without decoration. No justification. No context providing. Just the straight acknowledgement of someone who understood the specific weight of what they were admitting. Lena is alive, Seraphina said. Something happened in his face that she looked away from because it was the kind of thing a person should be allowed to have privately. We have to move, Nora said from behind them. The facility. Police are on scene. We have 40 minutes before this district gets complicated. Cale pulled himself back from wherever he had briefly been. He looked at Seraphina. I need you to know something. Tell me while we move, she said, and started walking. He walked beside her. The night Lena disappeared, I was supposed to pick her up from a friend's apartment across the city. I was late. 40 minutes. A meeting ran over. His voice had the flat tone she recognized, but it was working harder than usual to maintain its register. She took a car service instead. The driver was one of Voss's recruitment contacts. He paused. I have been 40 minutes late to that pickup every day for 4 years. Seraphina walked and listened and did not offer the kind of comfort that would make him feel that someone was managing the pain rather than witnessing it. She had learned, the hard way, that those were different things. We're going to get her back, she said instead. You don't know that. No, she said. But we're going to try with everything we have, and that's the only answer that matters right now. They reached the car, got in. The city moved around them. The next 6 hours were the most compressed of Seraphina's life. They moved 3 times, first to a secondary location Cale kept in the Southern District, then to Fenn's offices in a building that presented itself as a commercial law firm, and she was beginning to understand several other things simultaneously. Each move was preceded by Nora's perimeter checks and Cale's communications with people she was not introduced to and would not have recognized if she had been. At Fenn's offices, the documents were processed. A woman Seraphina didn't know. 50s, reading glasses, the precise and merciless efficiency of someone who had spent decades finding things inside financial records that other people had worked hard to hide. Went through every file with focused speed and built a structural map of Knox's money laundering operation on a whiteboard that covered an entire wall. It was more comprehensive than Seraphina had realized. She had known the pieces. Seeing them assembled was different. Seeing the scale of what Everett Knox had been doing, the quantity of money moved, the implication of how many people that money represented. She stood in front of that whiteboard for a long moment and breathed through her nose and felt the nauseating arithmetic of it. Ben stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He'd said enough this morning. The ardent meridian connection, she said quietly, so only he could hear. I've been working on isolation strategy for 3 months, he said. If we control the disclosure, proactive rather than discovered, it changes the legal architecture significantly. Cale knows you talked to me. I assumed he would. Are you worried? Ben looked at the whiteboard for a moment. I've been worried for 11 months, he said. I'm used to it. By mid-afternoon, they had a strategic framework. By 4 o'clock, 2 of Cale's legal contacts, men who existed in the careful gray space between legitimate law and the kind of work that required discretion above credentials, had reviewed the documentation and confirmed what the financial analyst had mapped. The evidence was sufficient, more than sufficient, but Voss was moving. Nora tracked it in real time on a system Seraphina didn't fully understand but could read the outputs of. Locations, communications intercepts, vehicle movements. Voss had consolidated his remaining people after the facility. He had made contact with 3 of Knox's senior security personnel. And at 3:47 in the afternoon, a communication was intercepted that contained Seraphina's name, her photograph, and an address. Not the current address. The sublet on Harker Street. He thinks she might go back for something, Nora said. She won't, Cale said. He doesn't know that. Seraphina looked at the intercepted message on Nora's screen. Her photograph. Taken at the gala, she thought, or possibly sometime before. Her name. The address. And a second name in the message that made the room go cold. Everett Knox. Voss and Knox had not merely aligned since the gala. They had been communicating since last night. The message was coordination, not Voss directing Knox, not Knox directing Voss, but two men who had separately decided that Seraphina Vale was the point of maximum leverage against Kyle Draven and were now working in synchronized purpose. "He'll use me," Seraphina said, "to make Kyle stop." "Yes," Kyle said, "or to make you make a mistake." She looked at him. "Emotional decisions. That's what you said about Knox. Predictable because he's never faced a consequence." "Knox is predictable." Kyle looked at the communication on Nora's screen. Voss isn't. Voss uses predictable people as instruments. Which means Knox thinks he's in control of this and he's not. No. A pause. Which makes him more dangerous, not less. The afternoon moved toward evening, and the light outside Fenn's office windows shifted from gray to amber to the specific deep blue that preceded Blackthorn's night. Seraphina ate something she didn't taste and drank coffee that was too strong, and sat in a chair in the corner of the room where she could see both the door and the window and felt the day's accumulated weight settle into her skeleton. She was not the same person who had stood on a terrace in a midnight blue dress 20 hours ago. She knew this with the specific bodily certainty of someone who had passed through a membrane they had not known was there until they were on the other side of it. She felt the difference in the way she held her shoulders, in the way she looked at the room's exits before she looked at its furniture, in the calculation that ran behind her eyes constantly now, updating. Kyle came and sat across from her at 7 in the evening. The cut on his forearm had been bandaged. She hadn't seen when, had been in a different room, and he moved his arm carefully but without complaint. "Knox made a public statement this afternoon," he said. "Press conference. He's claiming the documents are fabricated, preemptive." He paused. "His attorney is already building the narrative." "How much damage?" "Depends on the timeline." He looked at her. "We move against him in 72 hours. If we wait longer, the narrative solidifies." 72 hours, she said. "Voss moves before that," he said. "He knows what we have. He'll try to neutralize it before we can use it. By coming after me." He held her gaze. "I won't let that happen." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to protect me," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me the plan so I can be part of it rather than a variable in it." He studied her for a moment. Then, "There's an abandoned district on the north end of the city. Cathedral Quarter. The old buildings from the harbor expansion that were never demolished. Voss has been using the underground tunnel network there for storage and transit for 2 years. He paused. "We're taking it." "When?" "Tomorrow night." "And Knox?" "Knox will be there." He looked at her with the steady, unreadable quality that she had spent 20 hours learning to read and still found opaque in specific registers. When he hears Voss is moving, he'll go to ground in the one place he thinks is secure. He's been to the Cathedral District twice in the last month. Nora tracked it. A pause. "He doesn't know we know." "He'll bring people." "Yes." "And Lena?" "Fenn has a team working the location from the communication intercept. She's being held in a facility 40 miles from the city. We move on it simultaneously with the cathedral operation." He paused. "Separate team, clean, no connection to anything happening downtown." Seraphina processed this. The architecture of it, the moving parts. "You've been planning this for a while," she said. "I've been waiting for the piece that made it viable," he said. "The documentation was the piece. And now you have it." "Now we have it," he said. The correction was deliberate. She felt it land. She looked at the window. Blackthorn outside glowing in its nighttime performance. All those lights suggesting warmth while underneath it, in tunnels and offices and the back rooms of buildings that presented themselves as something ordinary, the machinery of the next 24 hours was assembling. "I want to be there," she said. "Tomorrow night." "No." "Kyle, you're the case," he said. "You're the evidence and the testimony and the legal thread that runs through all of it. If something happens to you—" "Nothing is going to happen to me," she said. "And I'm not asking as a tactical request. I'm telling you that Knox is going to be in that building, and I am going to look at him, and I am going to be there when it ends." She looked at him. "He spent 3 years making me small. He doesn't get to do that anymore. Not even by keeping me safe in a room somewhere while other people finish it." Kale looked at her for a long time. "You understand what it's going to be," he said. "I understand enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood. "Stay close to Nora." He looked at her. "Don't do anything without telling me first." "Agreed." He moved toward the door. He stopped there, half-turned, with his hand on the frame, and the hallway's light coming in at an angle that showed the line of the old scar on his jaw and the cut of his face and the particular quality of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was approaching, at last, the place where he was going to be able to set it down. "Seraphina." She looked at him. "Thank you. For the drive. For this morning." He paused. "For not walking away when you found out about Ardent Meridian." She held his gaze. "I found out about Ardent Meridian, and I found out about Lena at the same time," she said. "The first one told me about your worst mistake. The second one told me about what you've been doing with it." She paused. "People are more than their worst mistakes. I know that better than most." He looked at her for a moment that stretched into something she didn't have a word for yet. Then he went out, and she was alone with the window and the city and the 24 hours that were coming like weather that had been building for years, and she looked at her own hands in her lap, steady now, genuinely steady for the first time in as long as she could remember. And she thought about the tomorrow that was coming and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was moving towards something rather than away from it. She slept 4 hours. It was enough. The cathedral district of Blackthorn City occupied the northern edge of the old harbor quarter like a jaw that had forgotten how to close. 3 blocks of stone buildings from an earlier century, a theater, 2 civic halls, and the cathedral itself, which had burned in a fire 17 years ago and been left in its scorched state because the cost of demolition and the cost of restoration were both prohibitive, and the city had simply chosen the third option, which was to fence it off and forget about it. The fence had long since been compromised by weather and the particular human talent for finding ways into places marked as inaccessible. The cathedral's stone shell stood intact, its roof partially collapsed, its windows open to the sky, the stained glass long since fallen or removed, the stone floor cracked and weeded and pooled where the drainage had failed. It was raining again when they arrived. Of course it was. Blackthorn in November understood its role in a certain kind of story. They came in 3 vehicles from 3 separate directions at 11:17 at night. Seraphina was in the second vehicle with Nora and 2 of Kael's most seasoned people. She had learned their names by then, or the names they used operationally: Resh, who was quiet and systematic, and a woman called Carver who moved like she had been designed for rooms where things happen fast and badly. Kael was in the first vehicle, ahead of them. Fen was not present. Fen was 40 miles away, coordinating the team moving on Lena's location, the 2 operations running in parallel on a timeline that had been synchronized to the minute. Seraphina was wearing dark clothes, flat boots, and the bracelet she had worn to the gala, the one with the blade inside, which she had retrieved from the sublet apartment that morning in a quick, specific operation Nora had managed with practiced efficiency. She had also been given a phone with a single contact loaded, Kael's operational number, and a sidearm she had held in her hands for 5 minutes while Resh watched and said nothing. She had given it back to him. "I'll use it if I have to," she said. "I don't want to carry it, hoping I have to." Resh had looked at her for a moment, then pocketed it without comment. The vehicles stopped 2 blocks from the cathedral perimeter. They went the rest of the way on foot, through the dark and the rain, using the building shadows and the route Nora had mapped from 3 days of reconnaissance that Seraphina was only now learning had been underway since before the gala. The operation had been longer in preparation than she'd been told. She filed that away without comment. At the perimeter, Kael's advance people had already confirmed Voss's presence. 4 vehicles inside the fence line, estimated 12 to 15 personnel. And Knox's car had been tracked to the district 40 minutes earlier, which meant he was already inside, already gone to ground in the one place he thought was impregnable. Kael pulled up beside her at the perimeter. In the rain and the dark, he looked like the version of himself that rumors were built on. All hard line and deliberate stillness, the scar pale against the wet cold of his face. He looked at her once, directly, and the look contained everything that a conversation in the next 30 seconds didn't have room for. And then he looked at Nora and gave a hand signal, and they moved. They went in through a gap in the fence on the cathedral's south side. The stone shell of the building rose around them as they entered. Massive, roofless in sections, the rain coming straight through where the vaulted ceiling had collapsed and hitting the cracked stone floor in patterns that sounded like something breathing. The walls were intact, which meant the interior was dark, and the dark was the kind that required real adjustment, the kind that made the first 30 seconds after entry a matter of reading shadows rather than shapes. Seraphina moved behind Nora, close, using the technique she'd been told during the drive. Step where the person ahead steps. Stop when they stop. Keep your breathing below your own hearing. She could hear voices somewhere in the cathedral's forward section, toward what had been the nave, where the floor opened up beneath the largest collapsed section of roof, and the rain came down in a concentrated fall. She recognized one voice before she saw its source. Everett. He was arguing. His voice had the strained quality of a man who was losing an argument with someone he couldn't afford to lose it with, doing the things Seraphina had watched him do in boardrooms and at dinner tables and in their penthouse at 2 a.m, using volume and certainty as substitutes for position because his actual position was weaker than he needed it to be. She and Nora reached a stone pillar in the transept and stopped. From here she could see the nave. Voss was standing near the center of the rainfall with the particular ease of a man who was not bothered by water or darkness or the inherent absurdity of having a business meeting in a burned ruin at midnight. He had 4 men visible immediately around him, and she didn't doubt there were more in the shadows at the edges. Knox was to Voss's right, looking the way she had never quite seen him look. Not the charcoal tuxedo now, a dark coat over what looked like the remnants of a formal shirt, his hair wet and his jaw tight, and his eyes doing the rapid calculating movement of a man who was realizing, serially, that his calculations had been wrong. The documents exist, Voss was saying. He spoke with an unhurried patience that was in itself threatening. The drive was empty, yes, but the physical files are accounted for. They have them. Then we move on the legal track, Knox said. My attorneys are already... Your attorneys, Voss said, with a mild emphasis that reduced everything Knox had just said to something irrelevant, are useful for the image problem. They are not useful for the operational problem. He looked at Knox steadily. The operational problem is Draven. The operational problem has always been Draven, and the instrument Draven is using is your former wife. Knox's jaw tightened. I'll handle Seraphina. You've said that twice now. The first time was before the gala. The second time was this morning after the storage facility. Voss tilted his head. You haven't handled her. She's one woman. She's the evidence, Voss said simply. She's the testimony. She's the thread that runs through every piece of documentation your very expensive attorneys are going to have to dismantle in court. He paused. And she has been, from the moment she started gathering that documentation, considerably more capable than you gave her credit for, which is, I think, a pattern with you and her. Knox was silent for a moment that had a specific texture, the silence of a man being accurately described by someone he cannot afford to contradict. Seraphina pressed her back against the stone pillar and felt the cold of it through the fabric of her jacket and breathed. Nora was beside her, still, listening, phone in hand with the operational feed running. A vibration in Nora's hand. She looked at the screen, shielded against the rain, showed it to Seraphina. One word from Fenn, confirmed. Lena was out. The team had reached the facility. She was out. Seraphina looked at the screen and felt something release inside her chest that she hadn't known was held, a tension she had been carrying since the parking structure when a man with a scar and a still face had said, I don't know about whether his sister was alive. And she had decided, on the basis of that specific honesty, to trust him with everything she had. She reached past Nora and typed back one word. Tell him. Nora looked at her, then nodded, forwarded the message. 20 feet away, Kael's phone vibrated once in the interior pocket of his jacket. She couldn't see him. He was in the shadows of the south aisle. But she knew he received it. She knew because the quality of the darkness where he was changed in some way she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't spent 4 days learning to read his silences. Knox was talking again, outlining a plan that involved money and legal strategy and the kind of institutional insulation that rich men build around themselves across years and decades, believing that the insulation is permanent because it has worked repeatedly. He talked with the energy of a man who needed to hear himself say the plan in order to believe it would work. Voss listened. His expression said he had stopped finding Knox useful approximately 40 minutes ago and was deciding how to manage the conclusion of that assessment. "We can still control this," Knox said. "The narrative—" "Everett." Voss used his first name and Knox stopped. "The narrative is not the problem. The problem is that a woman you underestimated for 3 years of marriage and then underestimated again for the 11 months since she started gathering evidence against you has built an airtight case with the help of the most capable operator in this city." A pause. "The narrative does not survive that." Knox looked at Voss. Something shifted in his face. The specific shift of a man removing the performance layer because he no longer has the energy for it. What was underneath was not softer. It was harder and uglier and more honest than anything Seraphina had ever seen from him in 3 years of proximity. "Then what do you suggest?" Knox said flatly. "I suggest," Voss said, "that we find Ms. Vale tonight and—" He stopped, because Kyle walked out of the south aisle into the nave. Not running, not with the tactical crouch of someone making a military entry. Walking. The same deliberate, unhurried way he occupied every space he entered, as if he had already calculated the room and found it workable. His people came in simultaneously from 3 other points of entry: the north transept, the collapsed doorway at the east end, the gallery above, and the geometry of their positioning said, without anything needing to be spoken, that the 14 men Voss had distributed through the cathedral had been located and were already being managed. It had taken them 11 minutes from the perimeter. Seraphina had not fully understood what she was watching during those 11 minutes. She understood it now. Voss looked at Kyle across the rain-wet nave with the expression of a man arriving at an expected destination. Draven. Voss. Kale stopped 15 feet from him. "It's over." "Is it?" Voss looked around at the positions of Kyle's people with the unhurried assessment of someone doing mathematics. "You're confident." "The documents are with federal contacts," Kyle said, "filed 40 minutes ago. Both the Knox financial network and your operational infrastructure, the routing codes, the account transfers, the logistics architecture." He paused. "All of it." Something moved through Voss's face. Fast. It was the first time Seraphina had seen anything move through Voss's face. "Ardent Meridian," Voss said. "Disclosed," Kyle said, proactively, "by my attorneys with full context, filed alongside the prosecution evidence." He held Voss's gaze. "You had that card. It's gone." Voss looked at him for a moment. Then he did something that surprised her. He almost smiled. Not the muscle-only version, something closer to genuine, in the specifically cold way that certain people are genuine. "You disclosed your own exposure." "I disclosed a mistake I made 4 years ago," Kyle said. "Yes, that will cost you." "I know what it costs." A pause. "It costs less than using it as leverage would have." The rain came straight down through the cathedral's open ceiling and hit the stone floor between the 2 men and spread in small dark circles. Around the edges of the nave, the shadows were resolving into the shapes of people who had weapons leveled and were waiting. Knox had been standing slightly behind Voss's right shoulder during this exchange, with the quality of a man who has been told to stay back, and has complied because he has correctly assessed that the people around him are operating at a level that makes his own calculations irrelevant. Now he stepped forward. "This doesn't end like this," he said. His voice had the strained, reaching quality of a man trying to reassert control over a room he'd lost. "I have people, what? The commissioner, 2 federal judges, half the city council. Had," Kyle said. "Past tense. Fenn's people have been in contact with 3 of them in the last 6 hours. Documentation specific to each of their individual involvement." He looked at Knox steadily. "They're not your people anymore." Knox stared at him. "Everett." The voice came from behind Knox. Not Kyle's, not Voss's. Seraphina's. She had moved out from the transept pillar. She was standing in the edge of the rainfall, where the water from the ceiling came down in its curtain, and the stone floor was dark and wet, and she was looking at Everett Knox from a distance of 20 feet, with an expression that she had not planned and was not performing. The expression of a woman who had finished something and knew it. Knox turned. He looked at her and she watched his face cycle through several things quickly. Calculation, anger, the residual reflex of contempt, and then, underneath all of it, something she had never once seen on his face in 3 years of marriage. Something that took her a moment to identify because she had so little reference for it from him. Fear, not of Kael, not of Voss or the men or the weapons in the cathedral. Of her. Of the woman in dark clothes with wet hair and steady hands standing in the rain that fell through the burned-out ceiling, who had spent 9 months gathering the evidence that was going to destroy him, and who was looking at him now with the patient, specific weight of someone who had already finished grieving everything he had taken from her. "You should have let me leave quietly," she said. Knox's jaw worked. "Seraphina, I didn't want this," she said. "I want you to know that. I wanted to be gone. I wanted to build something new and not think about you." She kept her voice even, not cold, just real, the way things are real when you've burned through everything performative. "You made that impossible. You followed me, you threatened me, you put men at my apartment, and you aligned with the worst person in this city because you couldn't let a woman you spent 3 years diminishing just walk away." Knox said nothing. "You couldn't let me walk away," she said, "because if I walked away intact, it meant you hadn't actually diminished me. And you needed that to be true." She looked at him. "You needed me to be nothing so you didn't have to think about what you were." The rain fell. Knox looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face hardened into the last version of itself. The version without the performance layer or the fear. The version that was just the naked mechanism of a man who had been powerful for so long that he had confused power with immunity. He moved fast, faster than she'd expected because she had never seen him move with physical intent. Everett Knox was a man who used words and money and institutional leverage, not his body, and the incongruity of it almost cost her the second she needed. Almost. She was already moving when his hand reached for the weapon his security man had apparently given him at some point in the evening, and she was inside his reach before he had it fully out. And she did what Nora had shown her during the 3 hours in the South District safe house that morning. Not complicated, nothing trained, just the specific application of an elbow to a wrist at the right angle and the leverage of her own weight into his. And the weapon was on the wet stone floor and Knox was off balance, and her bracelet blade was in her hand. She did not use it. She held it where he could see it, between them, at the distance of a decision. Knox looked at the blade, looked at her face. His breathing was ragged, not from exertion but from something she recognized in the physiology of it, the specific respiration of a man experiencing the concrete reality of consequence for the first time. "I'm not going to kill you," she said. "I want you to hear your name in a courtroom. I want you to sit in a chair and listen to everything read back to you with a jury watching your face." She looked at him steadily. "That's what I want. That's what you're going to give me, because it's the only version of tonight where I let you walk to a car with your hands behind your back instead of your face on this floor." Knox's hands were shaking. She saw it. She noted it without satisfaction, because satisfaction was not what she felt. She felt the specific empty clarity of a conclusion, which is its own thing entirely. He went to his knees, not dramatically, not all at once, but the knees bent and he went down onto the wet stone floor of the burned cathedral in the rain that fell through the missing ceiling, and his face did what faces do when everything they were built on goes out from under them at once. Kael's people moved in. Knox was secured. Across the nave, Voss's men had been systematically neutralized. Most without violence, two with it, all of them now contained or positioned to be. Voss himself stood at the center of what had been his domain 20 minutes earlier with his hands at his sides and the same composed, unreadable quality she'd observed in him from the beginning. But the composition now was holding something beneath it that it hadn't been holding before. She could see the effort of it. "Lena," Kael said, looking at Voss. "Where exactly?" Voss looked at him for a moment. Then, apparently deciding that a specific form of honesty was the only useful currency remaining to him, he gave an address. Fen had already reached her, but Kael stood and received the address and kept his face still and nodded once. "She's already out," Kael said then. "My people reached her 40 minutes ago." Voss absorbed this. Something moved through him. Not regret exactly, but the specific recalibration of a man who has played a card and discovered it was already in the other person's hand. You used her as misdirection, he said. You wanted me to think the leverage was still viable. I wanted you focused on the wrong variable, Kael said. Yes, Voss almost smiled again. And the Ardent Meridian disclosure. That was tonight. Filed tonight. Yes. You waited until you had Lena before you filed it. A pause. Yes. Voss looked at him for a moment. I underestimated what you'd sacrifice, he said. Most people do, Kael said. Then he turned to Nora and the rest followed quickly, efficiently, the way the conclusion of long and costly things follows when the last variable has finally resolved. Voss was transported in a separate vehicle, Knox in another. Federal contacts, the ones Kael maintained with the careful, bilateral precision of a man who understood that even the underworld functioned better with certain institutional relationships intact, were waiting at a location Seraphina was not told, because by then she did not need to be told everything, only the things that were hers to carry. She stood in the cathedral after the vehicles left and listened to the rain on the stone and looked at the walls around her. The old, scorched walls that had held their shape through fire and abandonment, and the gradual reclamation of weather and time. There was something in the texture of them she found she couldn't look away from, the way things could burn almost completely and still be standing. Kael came and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Fen says Lena is at the medical facility, he said, finally. She needs time, but she's coherent. She asked if I was coming. A pause that had the specific weight of 4 years in it. I told her I'd be there by morning. Seraphina looked at the stone wall. Go, she said. Go now. I will. He didn't move immediately. He stood in the rain and the ruined space, and she was aware of him beside her. The height of him, the quality of the stillness that was different now from how it had been at the beginning. Less like armor, more like something a person carries when the thing they were bracing against has finally passed. Are you all right? She thought about the question, really thought about it. I don't know yet, she said. I think I will be. That's honest. I'm working on being honest as a default setting, she said. It's harder than it sounds. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. The first she'd heard from him. It changed the quality of his face briefly, and she looked at it and thought, there's a person in there that almost no one sees. She filed that away too, not to use, just to know. The Foundation, he said, the organization you asked for. Fen has already begun the structural work, legal registration, funding architecture. He says 6 months to operational status if we move consistently. I know, she said. He told me this afternoon. He tells you a lot. He told me the things I needed to know, she said. That's different from a lot. Kael looked at her. In the ruined cathedral in the rain, with the evidence filed and Knox on his way to a facility and Voss beside him and Lena in a medical bed 40 miles away asking if her brother was coming, he looked at her with something that had no armor in it. I'm sorry, he said, for the decisions I made without asking you, at the gala, in the parking structure. A pause. For the things I should have told you and didn't. She looked at him. I know, she said. I accepted the apology when you said we have it instead of I have it. He held her gaze. Go to your sister, she said. He went. She stood in the cathedral alone for a while after that, and let the rain do what rain does and breathed the cold stone smell of a place that had burned and been left and was still standing anyway. Then she walked out through the south gap in the fence and into the streets of Blackthorn, which were wet and lit and running with the ordinary nighttime energy of a city that would wake up tomorrow morning to news that was going to rearrange certain things and leave others exactly as they were. Because cities were like that, transformable in their power structures and stubbornly unchanged in their daily texture. Nora was waiting in the car. She looked at Seraphina when she approached and didn't say anything, which was, Seraphina had come to understand, Nora's particular form of communication in moments that didn't require words. She got in. The city moved past the windows on the way back. The nighttime version of it, quieter than its daytime self, but not quiet, never quiet. Always running its parallel operations of commerce and living and ambition and ordinary human need. She watched it and felt the specific, strange sensation of being inside her own life in a new way. not as someone moving through a space defined by someone else's coordinates, but as someone whose coordinates were her own to set. The months that followed had their own pace and their own complications, because conclusions were not the same as endings, and Seraphina had learned, at some point in the long education of the previous year, to distrust the idea that anything finished cleanly. The case against Everett Knox moved through the courts with the slow, grinding thoroughness of the legal system doing something it was built to do. His attorneys were expensive and competent, and they fought every document and every chain of custody and every procedural angle available to them, which was exactly what she had expected and had prepared for. The Ardent Meridian disclosure complicated Kael's position. As Fenn had predicted, it generated coverage and investigation and 2 months of difficult institutional navigation, but the proactive nature of the disclosure and the weight of what it was disclosed alongside ultimately worked in the direction Fenn had calculated. There were costs. Kyle paid them with the same flat, factual quality he brought to everything else. Voss did not go quietly. There were 3 separate legal challenges in the first 4 months, and 2 incidents that Seraphina was not told the details of and did not ask about. By the 6th month, the challenges had been resolved in ways that left the operational infrastructure permanently dismantled. Voss was remanded to federal custody on 17 counts, and the trial was scheduled for the following year. Knox stood in a courtroom on a Tuesday in early March, with his attorneys at his left and the weight of 9 months of documentation at his right, and he heard his name read back to him in the specific cadenced language of legal indictment that strips the performance from everything and leaves only the factual record of what was done and to whom. Seraphina was in the gallery. She watched him hear it. She watched his face do the thing she had waited for. Not collapse, not break, but register. The specific registration of a man finally inside a consequence he could not buy his way out of, sitting in a chair under fluorescent light, while the machinery he had spent 20 years building was read back to him as a list of crimes. She stayed for the entire session. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which she supposed was appropriate. Expectations and reality rarely aligned in the important moments. What she felt was quieter than triumph and more permanent, something that settled rather than spiked. The specific resolution of a thing that had been suspended for a long time finally coming to rest. Margot found her outside the courthouse afterward, which Seraphina hadn't known to expect, and they stood on the courthouse steps in the cold March air, and Margot said nothing for a moment and then said, "You look different." "I am different," Seraphina said. "Good different, or just different." She looked at the street. "It's not a before and after. It's more like, I know what I'm made of now. You don't always know until it gets tested." Margot looked at her for a moment. "And Draven?" Seraphina was quiet for a beat. "That's complicated." "Complicated how?" "Complicated in the way that things are complicated when you meet someone in the worst circumstances and find out they're real." She paused. "I'm figuring it out." She was figuring it out. Lena Draven required 8 months of medical and psychological support before she was stable enough to begin something resembling normal life, and during those months, Kael was less present in the operational sense and more present in the human sense, visiting facilities, coordinating care, learning how to be a brother again to a person who had been changed by 4 years of what had been done to her in ways that were going to take a long time to map. Seraphina met Lena once during this period, briefly, at the medical facility outside the city. Lena was 20 and thin, and her eyes had the quality of someone who had seen specific things and was in the process of deciding what to do with having seen them. She looked at Seraphina and said, "You're the one who gave him the documents." "Yes," Seraphina said. Lena nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. The 2 words had the weight of everything they were standing in for. The Seraphina Veil Foundation opened its doors on a Wednesday in September with considerably less ceremony than Seraphina had anticipated. The building was in the Southern District, 3 floors, unglamorous exterior, good bones, and the staff were people who had been recruited by Fenn through networks that understood what the organization was actually for. Legal aid for trafficking survivors, psychological support, assistance with documentation, housing, employment, the practical architecture of what came after, which was the hardest and least visible part of survival. She stood at the entrance on the opening day and looked at the building and felt the gap between the idea of it and the reality of it. the specific grounding gap that existed between imagining a thing and standing in front of it after all the work of making it real. Cale was there. He stood to the side, not in the photographs, not at the podium. He understood, without it being discussed, that his presence in the visible narrative of the Foundation would complicate it, and that complicating it was the one thing he should not do. He was there and not there in the way that he had learned to be in most public spaces, present in the room, absent from the record. After the opening, after the small crowd of staff and legal contacts and the two journalists Seraphina had carefully vetted had cleared, she found him in the building's back office. A plain room with a window onto the alley, a desk, 2 chairs. He was standing at the window looking at the alley with his hands in his jacket pockets and the afternoon light on the scar of his jaw. She sat in one of the chairs. He remained standing. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it. "Like the beginning of something," she said. "Not like an ending." He turned from the window, looked at her. "I'm not the same person I was at the gala," she said. "I know that. I think you know it too." She held his gaze. "I'm not interested in easy or clean or uncomplicated. I've had enough of easy things that turned out to be the opposite." She paused. "But I'm also not interested in performing casualness about something that isn't casual." He looked at her steadily. "So," she said. "So," he said. "Whatever this is," she said, "I want it to be real, not strategic, not protective, not a transaction." She looked at him. "And I want it to be slow because I have a lot to build, and I don't want to build it in someone else's shadow again." He came and sat in the other chair, across from her, at the plain desk in the plain room. He looked at her with the look that had started as inventory and had become, over the months, something else, something that saw rather than cataloged. "Real," he said. "Slow." "Yes." He nodded once, then, "I should tell you something." "Tell me." "When I had you followed at the gala, before I spoke to you on the terrace, I thought you were a means to an end." He said it without decoration. "I thought you had what I needed, and I would get it, and the rest would be administrative." A pause. "I was wrong about that." "I know," she said. "You knew then?" "I suspected. I watched you change your assessment in real time." She looked at him. "You're not as unreadable as you think." Something happened in his face that was close to the thing she had heard in his voice when Lena's name came over the phone speaker in the storage facility. The thing he didn't intend and couldn't entirely prevent. "Kael," she said. He looked at her. "She's going to be okay," she said. "Not the same, but okay." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I know." Another pause. "I'm trying to believe it." "That's enough," she said. "Believing takes time." Outside the window, Blackthorn went about its afternoon. The alley, the sounds of the street beyond it, the ordinary motion of a city that had absorbed its seismic event and continued, as cities did, because the daily machinery of life was more persistent than any catastrophe and more stubborn than any ruin. Seraphina looked at the man across the desk. This scarred, complicated, genuinely damaged man who had walked into the worst year of her life and become entangled in it in ways neither of them had chosen or planned, and felt the specific, groundless, entirely irrational thing that people feel when they recognize that something real has arrived. Not easy, not clean, real. She reached across the desk and put her hand on the surface between them, palm up, not reaching for him, just leaving it there. He looked at it. Then he put his hand over hers. The city ran its evening outside. The Foundation building settled around them with the particular quiet of a new thing at rest, and 2 damaged people who had been tested in specific and irreversible ways sat in a plain room in the late afternoon light and let what was real be real without asking it to be anything else. Above the city, the sky went from gray to amber to the deep, particular dark of a night that had nothing left to prove. And the skyline of Blackthorn held its shape against it. Unglamorous, enduring, lit by the accumulated evidence of a million ordinary lives being stubbornly, imperfectly lived, like something that had burned and stayed standing anyway.